Leadership is a tapestry interwoven with experiences, capabilities, and perspectives. I'm happy to share with you my conversation with a leader whose global experiences and deep regional perspectives are both enriching and empowering. Our guest today is Mr. KV Rao, who is a resident director for Tata Sons in ASEAN based in Singapore. This is just one hat that he wears. He is an advisor on multiple boards, chairs many industry associations, and currently leads the Singapore Indian Fine Arts Society. It is my pleasure to be in conversation with him, and I hope that you will find this segment interesting, informative, and insightful. So what is your experiences, KV, that could help leaders manage this current crisis that we're all in?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. You see, the crisis has hit the world nearly over 100 years back. I'll talk about it a little later.
Okay.
If you really want to know the history of the crises of the world and the pandemics and how the civilization of the world has survived through it. But the biggest thing that happens during a crisis is, I always say that you press two buttons together, the pause and reset in any electronic device.
Yes.
So if you do it on your iPhone, everything gets wiped out and you start as a new phone. So in some sense, when you have these two things happening, there's a tremendous amount of discontinuity and you need to adapt. And the world has gone through 90 days of change, which is unbelievable. I will stay away from how terminally it's affecting lives and sorrow and difficulty and problems and health and all of that. But at an individual level, everyone has gone through a certain kind of personal journey, and that journey is very important.
True.
What it has done is it has made you either very reflective or very reactive. If you're reflective, you start learning and discovering yourself, which you did not. So many people I see now singing songs and going into the kitchen and cooking and doing stuff. They haven't done it for 30 years, 40 years. They're all coming back at it. So it's a beautiful thing that's happened. Some who are extremely frustrated feel that, look, this is not my world. I want to run away from it and getting anxious, but there is no way you can go. So that's bringing another kind of a churn internally, but everybody has been churned. Yes. So when you get churned from inside, you start rediscovering yourself. And if you start rediscovering yourself, you reset yourself. And when you reset yourself, you know what your priorities of life are and how you can rework things. And one of the things about leadership is the leadership doesn't show in good times for any leader, since you asked me about leaders.
Yes.
Leaders show their mettle when you are against adversity.
Absolutely.
If you break down and the adversity takes charge of you, you're not a leader. You're a leader only if you are able to take charge of that adversity and do something about it. You may not solve it. You may not be able to resolve it. But the kind of confidence with which you move your life and how you bring positivity, you will spread that positivity around amongst your teams and amongst your groups and amongst the people that you're actually supposed to lead. So to me, I feel these are unprecedented times and periods of history. And these are also unprecedented times for personal growth. I don't think the kind of growth that you can achieve in 90 days, 100 days personally is also tremendous. Now, for instance, if you ask me about my own personal, I think I've saved much more time. I start my day at 9, I go on till 12, which is a normal routine for me, but then time spent on meetings and personal lunches and dinners and socials and talks and all of that has got reduced to everything electronic. At the click, I'm able to save time. So I've got a lot more time at my disposal. See, I always longed to write more as I grow older after 40 years of my experience. I like to share stories, write blogs, and there were magazines who approached me and said, why don't you write now, and so on. The last 90 days, I've done about 5 columns in Business World, which I would have never been able to do But for this time, so I see a lot of good things happening, and I think it depends on how you really react to it.
Yes.
So you need to be resolute, and a lot of work has to be done within oneself. And these are great times for bringing those changes.
So what is it that the world can learn from Tatas and to how not to waste a crisis? Are there any instances or stories that can motivate us?
It's an interesting one. It's an interesting question. See, we are in 152 years of our history. We're getting into the 153rd year.
Wow.
There are very few corporations in the world that have actually faced and seen pandemics.
Yes.
If you go to the Tata history, Tata survived through 3 pandemics.
Wow.
And the problem of humanity or management theory is we don't read history. We only study management subjects. It would be very useful for people to go back to history and read how human beings have managed similar problems and stresses and challenges. And it's always great learning.
Yes.
I was very amused to read this. The first pandemic came in Russia in 1889, and it was there for about a year. And it broke out in St. Petersburg. I don't know if you know the history of this. Those days, there were no aircrafts, by the way, but still it spread around the world and all of Europe. The second pandemic, which what you read in the press today, is the Spanish pandemic, which happened in 1918, and it went on for about 2 years. And do you know that 500 million people died during that period?
Yes.
There was yet another pandemic. And that pandemic is the Asian pandemic, which came in 1957 and went on till about 59. And Singapore was quite badly affected during those days. It was called the Hong Kong pandemic, or the Hong Kong flu. It was a bird flu, actually, similar to the SARS flu, which came. So the world has periodically been hit by this. It's not something that it has not happened, but human memory is so short that we tend to forget, and we get back to our own bad habits or our own comfort zones. Now, if you see a corporation that has existed through these 3, it is Tata's. And very interestingly, some of our people in Tata Steel in the history, the archives, brought out the posters that were put in Jamshedpur in the time when 1918 and 20 came. And that exactly talked about put on your mask, keep social distancing, don't do this, don't do that. It was so similar. And when I read it, I said, is it that the human intelligence has not evolved, or is it the basics are always the same? And see what we did then. 100 years ago, the first priority was save lives and livelihoods.
Yes.
We wanted to keep our people going and preserve their jobs, bring them hygiene, and so on. That was the first thing we needed to do. The second is save the community. And Tatas have always been about it, to go out and reach out to the communities in which we work, we live, and what can we do to the community to save them.
Yes.
The third was supporting science. How can we prevent it? How can we help it? And if I came back and said, do you have a new strategy? I'm surprised our strategy has been 100 years old. We're exactly doing the same thing even today. We are spending $300 million, 1,500 crores in India on COVID care at this time. We have expanded hospital capacities. We have invested in science. We are invested in education. We have created something called the e-doctor, the Tata Doctor online, so that today the biggest problem is you're unable to get a doctor. And if you go to Tata Health today and click, it doesn't ask you to even register. You can do a straight chat and you get a doctor on the other side. At no cost, you're able to at least talk to a doctor, which itself is a huge benefit. So I think this is something which is there in the Tata DNA, and I feel extremely privileged and blessed that I work with a group that thinks this way and behaves in a manner in which it thinks, and there is no gap between our thought and our action as far as care is concerned. The second is on the business side of it.
Yes.
We know that it's been a bad hit, and many of our businesses are definitely challenged around the world because we have 2/3 of our business coming out of 80 countries. So everywhere it has hit. It's not that COVID has not come in some parts of the world. Somewhere it's more severe, somewhere it's less.
Yeah.
But the discipline of conserving cash, running your operations with care, ensuring your employees are taken care of, pruning your costs in a sensible manner.
Yes.
So in our cost pruning, what we do is more like an inverted pyramid. The higher you are, the bigger is your cut or cost. You're sacrificing more. And the lower you are at the bottom, you really don't actually sacrifice, or more or less you're protected with it, which I think shows a lot of heart and care for the community of our people. And also, it has helped us to understand what is core, what is non-core, what is waste, what is not waste, and be very strong and build up your processes, so on. And what it has done magically is because we are very strong in information technology, and we help companies through our TCS in digital transformation. So what we could not have achieved perhaps, or what we would have achieved in about 3 or 4 years, we've achieved it in 3 months in terms of transformation on digital sort of journeys. So a lot of good has happened. So if there are learning lessons out of it for companies, I'm sure we are very open and it's all available, and one can always ask what Tata's did. Yeah.
Absolutely, absolutely. You're also on the boards of number of organizations, and there's always a strong aspiration, especially for women like me, and where we say, women on boards is a big agenda these days. I don't know whether it's like it's become like more like a tick box like agenda at some cases, and some cases you see genuine leaders there. But there is a lot that both men and women, both the genders, need to develop to move, and for boards to invite us and things like that. What's really the trick there, KV? What should we all be doing differently than what we are doing?
Good one. I suppose there is no trick really. Let me preface this by saying, Sripriya, the boards I'm talking about, conventional companies. I'm not talking the likes of the technology majors. But typically the conventional companies have a lot of conventions, and these conventions make boards very boring.
Wow.
Boards can be one of the most boring places to be, most predictable, and they always seem to associate gray hair with wisdom. And experience with capability. So there are a lot of fixes which are there in conventional boards, how they do. And therefore, there are 2 ways that you come into a board. To answer your question, one is you are networked in, and and somebody refers you and you get it.
Yes.
The second is you come on the basis of merit. There are a few boards which think, let's get somebody who's dissimilar to us. Let's get someone who can bring in a different perspective. So, and boards, compositions also depend a lot on the board leadership. I mean, the chairmen. And some chairmen can be very progressive, and they want to have consciously a greater debate, greater perspective, and so on. Whereas some of them are very happy to have a board which sort of stamps what they say. We disagree, but overall we agree kind of people, on the board. So there are different styles, and different sectors have different kinds of boards. Now, coming to women, I think all boards pay lip service to the fact that we would like to have gender balance, and we would like to have women and so on. And there is a wide race in India because there is a corporate requirement of 20% and so on. In Singapore also we have a similar thing. But there is a challenge to find willing, capable women who would like to come into the board and can bring that perspective and that balance as well. And I'm a great proponent that a part of the board, at least a third of the board composition, should be people who are extremely dissimilar. At one of the talks, I gave a keynote at the Institute of Directors of India, where I said, why don't we get an artist? Why don't we get a musician? Why don't you get a sportsman? Why don't you get a chef to sit in? Because today the boards are getting more of the same. See, the world is tragically, the whole education system, the training, the management, everyone believes that you can solve issues through numbers.
Yes.
So there is an overweight on the left brain thinking. So you get very similar thinking people, because if you look at a spreadsheet with the same formula, 5 people looking at it will come up with the same solution because it is so predictable and so rigid. But if you ask me, what are the 4 different ways we can handle this? And if you use right brain, I think the 5 people will come up with very different solutions. So you'll get a much richer texture of decision making if you have boards which are complex in personalities. But The challenge is to run a complex board is going to be very difficult for a chairman. So the chairman should be someone who believes in it, that yes, it helps, and therefore you can bring it. But to answer your question, I think your entry points usually are because you're known, and or you bring a certain skill which the boards want, and you've got a track record, and they say we would want. Because firstly, boards are meant to be helping companies to take risks.
Yes.
So that they can grow. And without risk, there is no growth. But most boards are risk averse totally. And they only think that their job is to actually risk manage, which is true. Yet, risk management doesn't mean no risk. Risk management means taking some good risks, calculated risks, so that the companies can grow. So I would always vote, or I will always lean in favor of board leaderships where we can bring very different people and a lot of women. I've been on boards where there are women, and they bring some phenomenal perspectives that sometimes just the men can't be sensitive to some of it, particularly on public boards and institutions. I've seen women contributing tremendously to it.
Wonderful, wonderful.
Tremendously. Yeah.
I mean, there is a lot of things about what you say, gender and moving women up and things like that. But in my thinking, I believe that every individual has both the masculine and the feminine, and it is more about the world needs a little bit more feminine leadership, and it could come from a male or a female. So how should the world be taking a call? Because one side you see all this talk about gender diversity and all of that, and there's a little bit of a fatigue also in the system because of just hearing those words. So what's really your take, I mean, on this masculine and the feminine?
Oh, well, I've had lots of debates, discussions, and very enriching conversations with some women who are involved in it, and they're women leaders. And there is a movement called the Shakti Leadership. A friend of mine runs that. Nilima, and I recommend, pardon me? Nilima, yeah.
Nilima Bhatt.
So she's a good friend, and we've had enormously long conversations. So if you just step back and see, basically, the symbol of woman or masculinity and femininity, feminine in the Indian spiritual sense, is basically Purusha and Prakriti.
Yes.
And Prakriti is everything, actually. Purusha is relatively, in the whole Indian spiritual tradition, it is Prakriti which really defines much more and much greater in the sense of what it can do to the creation, because all creation is dependent upon the woman. Now, coming to modern concept, this whole man versus woman is a strange versus somebody has put it, in life, in career, in companies. I would completely drop that versus. It's man and woman.
Yes.
Woman and man. And the moment you get out of the rhetoric of the debate, one versus the other, everything falls into place.
True.
And often I found women, partially they're responsible sometimes for what they get onto themselves. I'm not into blaming. The moment you think that I'm an individual who's capable of doing A, B, C, D, it hardly matters whether I'm a woman or a man. That confidence will render you to be where you are. It will actually beget a person that position. And I've always seen my young lady colleagues, they have a little bit of hesitation somewhere within them, and then they say that, look, is it okay for a woman to be there? I think I'm better off here. I said, I always believe, if you start believing in yourself, the world will accept you. The day you let people treat you as being saying, no, I think, madam, I think this is not what you should be looking at, then you should shut them up and say, look, what do you mean by that? Yes. So I think you will find enough votaries supporting you, because even amongst men, all are not the same. I grew up in a family where my mother has been a professional, my sister has been a professional, all the women in my family, my wife's an engineer. So all of them have had their careers, and we've come up in a manner where we treat a woman as an equal. So there is a societal issue. When we raise children, the mothers themselves raise their boys differently than the girls. I think that's so bad. It's so unfair. I think, why can't girls do what they want? Why should they only be looking at certain professions and certain education? So I think the whole evolutionary part of society and how we've treated women it has to change, and it will only change when a lady resolves,
Yeah.
that's it and no more. I'm going to be what I am. Then I think the confidence will come.
I mean, given your huge experience in the Southeast Asian markets, what's really some stories, KV, that have really influenced you here that we can all learn from?
Oh, well, let me give you a simile. I worked in India many years before last 25 years in Singapore and international. Even in India, I did a few years of international business. So now 40 years, maybe 10 was domestic, 30 years was international. I love cultures. I love how people think, how people behave, how people talk, and the disconnects between what they think, what they behave, and what they say. Because that's a cultural thing which will only over time will you learn what they meant and what they said and what they did.
Yes.
And this is a very, very interesting, more interesting than watching a Bollywood movie, which I don't watch, because it's as interesting or even more because it's real life. Now, I'll tell you a simile between India. India, if you've traveled from Manipur and Northeast and Assam and maybe Ladakh, which is very famous now, to Kanyakumari, which I've done actually.
Okay.
Every few 100 kilometers, culture changes.
True.
Language changes, accent changes, food changes, belief structures change. It's such a lot of color and variety that it is amazing. To the extent that people from one district will make a joke out of the other. You know, someone from Tirchi will talk about Tirunelveli and says Tamil is very different. You know, so it's so interesting. It's so varied. Now, when you look at Southeast Asia, when the Westerner talks about it, they talk about Asia as one big whole.
Yeah.
But when you look at the 10 or 12 countries of ASEAN and China and India and all of this region, it is amazingly different. The languages are different, the cultures are different, the business philosophies are different.
True.
And to me, I have spent quite some time on this subject. And what I've learned after all these years is culture is a function of your history.
True.
Your history is a function of your belief structure.
Mm.
Your belief structure is a function of your religious tendencies. So if you look at the Confucian philosophies that reign in all of, the Greater China, Mongolia, Indochina, there's a whole sweep of that. In Asia, you'll see a lot of beliefs, including in Singapore. If you trace back what is right and wrong, there is a Confucian tenet there, which is actually the governing philosophy that determines how you do business, which is right or wrong.
Okay.
True for Indians, the true for Buddhists. If you go to Thailand and the way their mannerisms are, the way they will conduct their business is so very different.
Yes.
Japan has a combination of old history, a lot of also Buddhism there. Similar is the case with Korea. So, I mean, each country, each part is very similar, yet dissimilar. So when you really transact with such people, when you do businesses with them,
Yes.
either you're going to sell, you're going to buy, or you're going to do something together.
Yes.
The level of cultural sensitivity that you develop
Yes.
and the kind of antenna that picks up so many more signals
Yes.
is what you become eventually if you work in the region. So I think that's a very rich experience. Very, very rich.
Absolutely.
I mean, Malaysia is so different. I mean, Malaysia has a different culture. Indonesia has a different culture. Malaysia is also a Malay culture with an overarching Islamic culture.
Yes.
Liberal Islamism, where you find also in Indonesia, for instance. And in Indonesia, there's a little pocket called the Javanese culture,
Yes.
where you have a little bit of a Hindus thing. So I don't think anywhere in the world you've got such profusion of rich cultures, which subliminally define how you behave.
True.
You might pick up an MBA class in Asian Institute of Management or SMU or NUS, and all of them study the same subjects. They all come from different upbringing and different countries,
Yeah.
Vietnam to Cambodia to Indochina to do that. But when they actually become managers, there's a little bit of them which will distinguish one being very different from the other based on how their personalities have been developed and how the inner core of their belief system works.
So is there any one or two strong tips, KV, that leaders migrating or working with Asian culture should really be cognizant about and, start practicing? Because it's not just the book that says, all this is how Asia does, this is how you do your handshake, this is how you do your business card. That's all good. But what else, KV?
Very good question. Anywhere in the world, cultural appreciation and cross-cultural appreciation is not a theoretical subject.
True.
You can be conceptually very clear, but practically miserable in that culture.
True.
It's a practice skill.
Yes.
So it's like saying, can I learn a music instrument? You can read a book, but you cannot play that music instrument unless you have actually trained yourself to do the step 1, step 2, step 3, step 4, and your fingers or hands have started moving on the right notations. Yeah. You won't make music, you'll make cacophony. So you have to be careful trying to be cross-cultural.
Yes.
I've seen people trying to be cross-cultural on arrival by reading this, 30-day books and 15-day books, or even master local culture or local language, and they pick up a few words here and there. But that can be very counterproductive because you might be ending up offending. If you don't say in Singapore the word la properly, or yes, lo, and what's the difference between this and there and how your intonation is, you can upset somebody quite badly because it looks like you're making fun of them. So you have to be very careful in practice too. It's a very sensitive subject. So you need commitment, and you need, when you talk about coach, you can't mentally coach. So you'll have to sensitize them. You can show movies, you can show pictures, you can show real life, and put some, pointers of do's and don'ts. Yes. I just wrote an article on, recently it came, I think it's just come in the business world, seal a meal. Seal a deal with a meal. And this is about going around and how clumsy we can be over a business situation and unwittingly be impolite. So there's a lot of coaching. There's something very interesting. When the American companies went into China, that was about 25, 30 years, the cultural coaches were the best paid. And the ones who ran this were the Japanese for some reason. Some Japanese management ladies went into companies in the US, corporations, large ones, the IBMs, the Microsofts of the world, and really ran classes. Now, let me give you an example.
Yeah.
This is so serious. I remember in my days in international marketing, there was a company in Germany, and I used to deal with them. And this is a real story. They wanted to open an office in Mexico, and they wanted a guy to go in there and learn the language. So they'll buy him a one-way ticket, buy him a home, give him money for his food, and give him an interpreter. 90 days to 100 days, he cannot even do a phone call except to send a message to his family. He speaks no other language than that language. He does nothing but eat only that food. He has to understand all the mannerisms, and within 100 days, they start stuttering and they started speaking Mexican language and Spanish, of course. And they become localized. I remember a group I used to work for, we used to send people into Russia, ditto, a lot of Indians. And then you give them an interpreter, put them there for 100 days, they don't come back, then they immerse. So you need that kind of commitment. Or you need to do yards for a long time with people who are able to train you for it. So it's more of a training skill rather than cultural knowledge. Cultural knowledge helps, mind you, at least it sensitizes you. But adaptability is again individual skill. Some people are very adaptable, very sensitive. Some people care a damn about how the other person feels. They're just going, on their deal or on their issue, and they're self-focused rather than focusing on others. So that's how it is.
You are very active on social media. We can see you. See you being there and talking about different things. Now, tell me, how really should one, increase engagement in social media? Because I see you doing some tricks there as well.
I think I'm a late starter on social media. I'm a curious person by nature. I'm very curious. So I have this. Thing that I used to do in my office. I used to pick up the youngest 5 in the office and take them out for a lunch. This is like a reverse mentoring. And I ask them to show me their phones and what do they have as apps. And I'll go and download those things which I didn't know at all, and then discover and find out how it works. Does it make sense or not? So I got hooked onto a bit of Facebook and a little bit of Twitter, but LinkedIn and all of these when they came. I've been on it for quite a number of years now because I had this thing about just being curious, and they were quite interesting, and it keeps me in touch with people. But I'm told now Facebook is no longer young people's platform. The core is 50 plus, so I think I'm in the right place. And I'm not an expert on that. I use it for my own friends and keeping in touch, and I enjoy doing stuff. But when you're talking about interests, I think I've been very privileged, Shruti. I grew up in Pondicherry, in Shivagos International Center of Education, where the purpose of education was not put on examinations, but trying to evoke all the energies of positivity that you have, the creativity that you have, and how you grew. I mean, that brings me to a lunch meeting that I had with Alibaba founder Jack Ma. And he started sharing in a small group with us saying that, look, he can't join back the company because he said in a very humorous way, I don't have an MBA from Stanford or Harvard, so I can't work for Alibaba. So I says, what are you planning? And he says, look, I've devoted myself to starting schools. And then he said, in my school, the first thing we will teach our children is music. I was surprised. Why did he talk? I mean, of course, I love music and part of my life. So he said, because music talks to the soul. The second is said, we will teach painting, drawing, and art. It opens the creative umbrella of the mind. He said, we do not have to teach them as much mathematics and science. And then in his typical way, he said, the machine will take over, artificial intelligence. So he says, we don't need intelligent people. We need people with wisdom. And that comes when your right side of your brain, the umbrella is opened up, and then you're able to be a more creative and more holistic, more complete person. So much before all of this, when I was a child, I studied in an environment where music, dance, art, poetry, cooking, name it. So I had lots of interests that I developed, and I was never sure what I would do. If you had asked me when I was 10 years old, I would have said perhaps I would have been a percussionist, or I would say I would have been a painter. But as life evolves, some of these interests have remained. They are not in the forefront, but I do take time out to keep myself engaged in these areas. And particularly classical music is a passion for me. I do a lot of community work too, because at the end of the day, if there is something that you can give back, you should. And I work for SINDA, which is the platform for the Indian community in Singapore, for the lesser privileged. And I do a lot of work in many areas. And also Singapore Indian Fine Arts Society, as I mentioned, it's a phenomenal organization. 72 years old, the early Indians set it up. We have, 16 faculties. We have about 2,300 students. We have Karnataka, Hindustani, and it's growing. And people of all ages come to it. And one of the big challenges is people think, music is when you're a child. You can start when you're in a preschool, but you can also start when you're 16. Because it's not that you're becoming a performer, but what you're doing is the endowment that, you have, creative endowment, has not been touched. And when you tickle it, you don't know what comes out of it. You can get a lot of peace. You can get a lot of joy. You can start appreciating music, and you become much more of a complete person. So I have a lot of interests which keep me busy.
Yes.
I must say one thing I don't watch TV.
Wow.
No TV.
I mean,
the reason is I have a personal belief. The TV shows you what they want to show you, not what you want to see. I'm happier being on my computer and see what I want. I do watch YouTubes, I watch videos, I watch news, but I do based on what I want. So I define my time, and I don't want to get things which are being fed into my mind. And other strange thing is I hardly watch any movies. Also, I'm quite happy reading. Rarely I'll watch a Hindi movie because I think my capacity is 1 in 3 years, because I find movies which are very predictable stories don't sort of excite me. So I like seeing art stuff or documentaries I enjoy watching. So those are my interests.
Tell me, KV, in all these things these diverse interests that you have, how have you evolved as a leader? What are the key traits or things how interest in these areas have given an edge for you in the corporate world? So what is it that leaders can learn and imbibe from the right brain?
Good question. I'll try and keep it a bit brief because the subject is a vast area which you have touched upon.
Yes.
See, leadership is very difficult to define.
Yes.
Again, because it's a practice and how you conduct yourself and how you do. But what differentiates exceptional leadership with also ran average leadership? An exceptional leader is not just a taskmaster. He gets the best out of you,
yes,
develops you,
yes,
and he's empathetic. And most importantly, he's able to inspire you to bring your best.
Sure.
Now, how do you light? It is like lighting a lamp within somebody which burns very bright. So where does the light rest in an individual that you're able to touch that person to an extent that the person is highly inspired to devote all the best and bring out?
yes.
And how do you coach? So there are many areas. So some are predictable things. Obviously, to be a leader, you have to have your mind in the right place.
Yes.
You have to be competent, you have to learn, you have to have skills, etc. But what are the things which are exceptional is the human dimension.
Yes.
Your ability to connect with people, your ability to be able to make sense. At a point in time, I was talking to senior leaders who were getting on to becoming CEOs, about 40 of them.
Okay.
And I came up with this very simple pointers that a good leader is a leader of 5 senses. Let me just develop for a minute.
Yeah.
You should have the ability, firstly, to hear. Hearing is one sense, right?
Yes.
And you hear what others don't hear. So you have a very perceptive ear. And the second most important thing I felt is the nose. Your ability to smell something which is a problem, you're smelling the rat or smelling the opportunity, doesn't matter.
Yes.
But you're able to see, you're able to do that. The third is eyes. You're able to see what others don't see. You have much ahead of them.
Yes.
Correct? And then you have your mouth so that you're able to communicate in a manner that is inspirational and empathetic.
Yes.
But the last but not the least is the ability to touch.
True.
And the touch is not just a physical pat on the back, but the ability to touch lives. Now that makes you a complete leader. So unless you have evolved as an individual yourself, you can't be real.
Absolutely.
So I would put 2 more pillars on which leadership rests. One pillar is about authenticity. You have to be real. You can't be something to make an impact. If you do that, people find out. In 1 minute, they'll say, this guy is saying for impact is not real.
Absolutely.
The second pillar is you have to be humble.
Yes.
The day you think you are a leader, you're not leading. The day you forget that you're a leader and you're a friend of the people,
yes,
and you have a role to play to take them to the destinations they belong, they can achieve, you'll be a very effective leader. So these are my learnings. And the last but not the least, I could say, your leadership style is also shaped a lot by your own personal experiences as a manager.
Yeah.
Since I've done 4 decades, I can tell you, when you work with some exceptional leaders very closely,
yes,
while you're working through them, it could be very stressful.
yes,
But when you come out of it, and after years later, you realize a certain style develops for you.
yes.
How do you manage a crisis? How do you manage a problem? How do you react in a situation like this? Suddenly, unconsciously, your styles get done on the basis of the master. Again, I take a musical example. When you go to a great master and learn,
Yeah.
you are sitting in the stage at times in the back with a tanpura and the great maestro is singing. You are just adding a few notes here and there. That's what your whole career is. But when the master goes, sometime you're coming back, I think the master sings through you.
Yeah.
So you get that kind of style, and you should be very fortunate. You should count yourself being very fortunate if you get to work with some leaders from whom you can learn a lot. Though
Absolutely.
it may be stressful, it's not easy to work with such people because they demand a lot. While they inspire, they can make your life very, very demanding. You know, I've gone through that. I've been very fortunate.
Yeah.
Someday I can write about all my great bosses.
What are your thoughts on spirituality and leadership? I mean, there is a large thing about purpose and spirituality, a lot of big words that we hear. What's your take on this vertical coherence, where you are today to what is the larger you there?
Okay, let me park words like spirituality and also leadership in the waiting room.
Okay.
Let's talk about life.
Yeah.
Life in itself is always a complete. It's a wholeness of life. You can't keep some parts out and some parts in. Either you're a leader or a worker, you're leading life.
Yes.
I'm leading life. You're an artist or a doctor or a medical professional or a frontline worker, whatever. You're spending your life energies in doing something gainfully for yourself to lead your life.
Yeah.
So when you talk about spirituality, it looks like these are different blocks and they're different rooms. It's not so. It's a complete whole. It's all one. And whether you're conscious or not is a different issue. You may not be conscious of your own spiritual sense. And if someone who says, what is this whole humbug about spirituality? I don't believe in anything to do with anything higher. I'm the highest creation of this life. And I know what I'm doing. But then you extinguish yourself someday. Right? Each one comes with an expiry date that's stuck on your body somewhere, but you can't read it.
Yeah.
It's in a cryptic code. And then you go, and then after that, there is no more life. Then why do you go? Because if you're alive and you're ultimate, you should be there forever. You should be an immortal being. So I won't get into that debate about spirituality because there are people who are believing in it or people who do not. But let me tell you, as a believer, why spirituality is integral to life. And if you look at the Hindu way of looking at it from our scriptures, life means jiva.
Yeah.
You know, all that we're doing is energy. And even physics talks about energy. Are you energetic or low energy, high energy? Where is that energy coming from? It's coming from somewhere within. It's just not the body, but there is something beyond the body.
Yes.
Therefore, the true Hindu tradition has sort of defined it as Jivatma. The one that gives you life is your spirit. And that's where the spirituality starts. It's within you, a speck. The other extreme of the greatness of the Indian spiritual tradition is there is a Jivatma within you, and right up there is a Paramatma, which is above all else who created this universe.
True.
And it connects the two by saying that one who created the entire universe and all of this is actually a permanent resident in you, in a small speck. And you may not be aware of it. You don't want to be conscious of it. All that is fine, but it still remains a permanent resident forever, till the time that you're alive. So the last thing I would tend to say is we spend a lot of our time looking at the externalities of life every day, but you know, we don't spend even 5 minutes looking at oneself. And we started with that point. Ensure that there is no pandemic within you. If there is peace within you and your elements are balanced reasonably well, no amount of a tornado outside is going to affect you because you'll still remain very peaceful.
Absolutely.
You see, I just want to add this because I think a large part of your audience may have an Indian component in there. A lot of our scriptures didn't come from people who have done PhD or double PhDs. Our scriptures were written by people who lived in mountains and they were called rishis or saints or mendicants and all that. And how did they get all of this knowledge? Did they get it from analysis and supercomputers and trying to do formulae? No. They got them out of deep silence. So how could silence give knowledge? Now, this is something you cannot answer. So I think in all our lives, if we can create those pauses, as I say, for some silence to look at yourself, I think a lot of things will sort yourself for themselves for you. And I think you will really flower into your fullness, into your full capacity and capability. I'm not sure whether I answered your question on leadership, but leaders have to be resolved individuals. If their leaders have problems of their own inferiorities, of their own insecurities, of their own fears, of their own angers and their own anxieties, that will show up. So I think they're not going to be very effective, or they will be not as effective as the real and true leadership.
We started this interview with the question of what should leaders do to manage this kind of crisis right now. But I want to take your pointers on what's going to be the future, KV, for as a business leader, as an individual with a strong sense of clarity and purpose. What's really going to be the future for people?
I think it's very important that it's never going to be business as usual.
Yeah.
The work out of home has shown the companies that you don't need really conventional offices. So that will be one disruption.
Yeah.
You could be working from anywhere, which can become very, very efficient for companies and individuals.
Yes.
On the other hand, if offices have provided you a canopy to spend 8 hours without really doing too much, we also have that proportion of people who come to office to fill their day, and then you're actually producing only 2 or 3 hours of work or even lesser. So we have enough of the people of different kinds.
Yeah.
I will give a siren call to people on measurements. Never before companies have ever measured the quantum of work delivered, which will become very, very difficult now, because if a management trainee or a young executive's main output is basically presentations, and in a month he produces 6 presentations, but he does a lot of work for the whole month, or makes board notes. Time will come where your compensations may get fixed on the effective measurable output rather than the time spent.
True.
That's going to be a very significant change.
Absolutely.
And it can be scary.
Yes.
Software engineers can be paid by the quantum of code produced rather than a salary.
Yes.
And the way a lot of people who we call support staff in organizations who are doing various administrative tasks might again get measured and say, depending on the number of calls you do, we'll decide how much you need to be paid.
True.
Not because you're sitting there for time. So the shift from time against output is one significant change.
Yeah.
I think will happen. Wonderful. The second area which I'm concerned is some roles will disappear.
Yeah.
Some jobs will just not be there. Yeah. So you need to rediscover yourself in terms of retooling, learning new skills to be relevant in those jobs. There will be clearly an expansion and more roles coming up in the digital space.
Yes.
But the one who's the fastest, quickest to learn and be able to adapt is going to be there.
Absolutely.
The third, people going through midlife between 40 to 50, which is difficult times, are likely to be facing even more difficult times. The youngsters, because they are more resilient, they'll have problems in finding employment, but they will survive. But my worry is, and the older guys, okay, they may have early retirements, but still they'll be all right. But the ones at 40 to 50s, there'll be a lot of stress on their plate, because the way businesses will transform themselves will impact them quite substantially. The adjustments in compensations, again, will dramatically change.
True.
And it's important for people to be realistic. As somebody said, you should be happy if you're breathing and alive now. That's a very profound statement.
Yes.
So you should be willing to come back to basics.
Yes.
People will have job losses. Job losses does not mean life losses.
True.
We often associate life with jobs so much. I've seen careers, I've seen even in normal times, people who have had 40%, 50% cuts, and then they come back when the situation is better. But people are unwilling. Today, if you ask people, because of the conventional sense, these mid-career guys, they go through depressions.
Yeah.
They literally bring so much more pain onto themselves. I think that resilience is very, very needed.
Yeah.
And the organization structures will undergo changes.
True.
I feel that the number of hierarchies that we have may not be necessary, because this period has proved that you don't need supervision of years and years and years. So a lot more matrix organizations will get enabled because of the digital disruptions.
Yeah.
So these are some of the changes that I can see very clearly. I can see some industries getting wiped out.
True.
Retail will have a very, very long-term impact, because if retail has got a long-term impact, tourism will have an impact. If tourism and retail has got an impact, petroleum will have an impact, and transportation will have an impact. So these are kind of disruptions that are difficult to predict, but there will be fairly strong impacts on those areas. But the core areas of supply chains, of people's consumption items, all of that will be fine. And the hope here is, world is full of poor people still. There's about 7.4 billion, more than half of them don't have enough to eat and move and live. So there is so much to be done. And if the world can get their priorities right, I think we can come out of this and build a new world order, which is every leader flies.
Yeah.
You are like a kite. You will go with the wind very far.
Yeah.
But if you don't have the rope or the thread to hold it tight,
yeah,
you will lose your very purpose and you may never come back. So that is the connectedness that you need to have. You need to fly, yet it has to be very tightly held from within you.
Absolutely.
Because that's you. Then only you're a leader.